Merhabalar arkadaşlar. Привет, как дела? Guten Tag. So these are some of the books that changed my way of viewing things in the world, at least as I remember. This is done. Yeah, some of the books that basically changed the way I think about life or myself. Not necessarily about how I think about niche topics, but I don't know. I'm kind of conceptualizing this video as there are some things in my mind that I think about more than others. And when those areas of thought are changed significantly, and what books were I reading at the time when those changes occurred? That's kind of how I viewed it. So the first one is the Oxford Handbook of Contemporary Phenomenology. I read this book really early on in my reading career. I would say 18. I think I started reading around 15, 16. At least seriously reading around 15, 16. The reason why I think this book is super interesting for people who haven't at least gone through phenomenology is to go through topics like this, like thought and action, thinking about the relationship between your actions and your thoughts. There's another interesting one called the edges of my body, and thinking about, is my body and the outside world, is this like a permeable membrane, or is it a continuum, right? That's a really interesting question. How practical it is, again, I don't know, but I don't think everything has to be practical, right? There's some interesting stuff on Husserl, right? About naturalistic egos versus scientific egos, and whether science should be under a naturalist account of the ego or consciousness, or if we should just take science as this one domain inside consciousness that is the only domain we can reference for knowledge. These are interesting questions that can really shape the way you view the nature of your own mind and to some extent reality. And so for that reason, a lot of my views were changed as a result of reading that book. The next one is a gem, I think. Philosophy in the Flesh, the Embodied Mind and its Challenge to Western Thought. So the reason why this book has the subheader, The Challenge to Western Thought, is because it basically reconceptualizes everything philosophy has said as being non-literal and metaphorical, right? So if we say a statement like, Johnny caught COVID, okay? That statement, according to Lakoff, would be relying on schemas and metaphors, right? So if we ask literally what it means okay, Johnny has this sickness in his body, okay? But if we were to ask Lakoff what it means, he would say, well, think about the expression caught, okay? That's a visual expression, okay? So it's usually understood as there's an object that is maybe thrown or moves down a pathway, and there's a receiver. And that kind of perception of those affairs then corresponds to what he calls a schema, maybe a pathway schema, where we understand an object is traveling a path, corresponds to a pathway schema in our brain, and we then use that our unconscious understanding of the pathway schema in our brain to map it to objects in the environment. So COVID traveled the pathway towards Johnny, and now Johnny received COVID. Something like this, right? That would be the way he understands it. And as a result, what that means is, it's not that when we do philosophy, we're making characterizations about the world around us, but much rather we're relying on our unconscious schemas and metaphors to understand the world around us. And it's not that these things are true about the world around us, it's that that's how we understand the world around us. So it's a difference in almost direction, where traditional philosophy projects claims onto the world, but he's saying, well, no, philosophy is actually relying on our already ingrained understandings, our born cognition, almost our innate cognition, to then understand the world around us. But it's not that they're being projected truths about the world around us. That's confusing. I've tried to explain this to a lot of different people, and they always say it's confusing. It was confusing for me at first here, so just read the book if you're more interested. Civilization and its discontents. I read this early on in my reading career. If you're someone who already understands social psychology, you could probably ignore this. However, if you want to get into the field, it's not a bad book, because the premise of the book is how do societies create social rules to avoid pain, suffering, embarrassment, stuff like this. The best example I remember from this book is he talks about a bunch of social rules around flatulence, farting, burping, belching. We have social rules around this to avoid being exposed to the bacteria, or the smell, the odors of these things. We have social rules around that stuff, right? He talks about, I believe, money. We have social rules around talking about money because people can get embarrassed if you have more money than them or if you have less money than them, something like this, right? We create rules around that to avoid the anxieties of these topics. That's kind of what the book is about, just creating social rules around topics that cause us harm or embarrassment. Does it matter, Alan Watts, man's relation to materiality? So, you hear like this cliche about like, don't be a materialist, don't be stuck to like brands and brand names and stuff like that, okay? That's not what this book is quite about. And in fact, I would even argue that Watts is okay with you being a materialist. The book is more about understanding the relationship to materiality, because someone who's not self-aware about how material things impact your consciousness and your ego and yada yada yada, then you're more likely to fall victim to being an unwitting materialist. I don't think that Alan Watts is all for like abandoning materialism. In this book, he just wants to talk about the relationship to materialism. In the same way that like there's some religious school where what they do is they build very complex sand sculptures and then they let the tide wash away the complex sand sculpture at night as a practice of not being attached to material things. Right? The lesson there is to like, if your beautiful material thing disappears, that's okay. It's not, the lesson is not, let's not do those material things, which I think is like a common misunderstanding. So this is a good book to read about this stuff. I highly recommend it. And it's quite easy and it's short. So I've talked about this book before, Beast and Man, The Roots of Human Nature. And I think this is a good book. The best way I can explain this book, right, and is why I think you should read it, and why it changed my view is, let's say you have a theory of human nature, and your theory of human nature is basically too zealous. Like I would say E.O. Sloan Wilson's views are very zealous. What's great about this book is she will say that, well, no. It's not that everything in culture is like human nature, right? It's more the case that like if we look at every culture, we could have something like family structure, where every culture has language, where every culture has hierarchies. But it's not the case that every culture is a matriarchy, or every culture is patriarchy, right? Or every culture, follows capitalism, or every culture follows communism, right? There's cultural variation that's based on very foundational components like family structure, hierarchy, and language, stuff like this, right? And that's the views she gives in this book. She also goes on a little bit about how if we look at some strictly human institutions, we need to be very cautious about saying that humans are the supreme moral animal, because arguably our institutions of torture are much worse than other animals, right? So, interesting book about that, more of like a centrist take on like the nature versus nurture debate. I think it's a good book. Last one is Evolution of Desire, Strategies of Human Mating. This book really basically this book just put a filter on everything I view for like humans. So I would argue that like this book reorganizes the conception of humans as mating is a significant component to every interaction, right? And there's a lot of evidence in this book to support that claim, and I'm not going to go over that. But I would say the main takeaway from this book is to like realize that mating is a significant component to human interaction, and it's going to apply a filter to everything, right? So when a male and a female, just as like a generic example, when a male and a female interact, it's no longer that there's like a strictly platonic lens you need to work with. You need to start working with an evolutionary framework for mating and reproduction. That's kind of like the takeaway from this book. That said, there are a lot of interesting studies in this book that are definitely worth reading on their own. So those are some books that like change the way I think about things in general. And that being said, ciao.